Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 134, Oscar W. Franz Oscar Wallin, nicknamed Charlie, was born in 1867 at Norrköping, Sweden. He trained as a seaman in the Swedish Navy. After leaving the Navy, he worked on a merchant ship until he jumped ship in Sydney in 1889. He originally worked as a woodcutter near Seymour, but his experience on the water drew him to Echuca and the paddle steamer trade. He started as an apprentice under Swanee Anderson, but quickly climbed the ladder, and by 1898 he owned his own boat, the Julia, which was in his possession until 1906. He married Diana Blanche Wallin, known as Daisy. Daisy was born in 1876 in Echuca to William Whalen, a storekeeper, and Diana Wortley. Daisy died in 1959. On the 22nd of April 1895, it mentions bronze medals to Albert de Forest, aged 36 years, and Franz Oscar Wallin, aged 27 years, boat hands on board the Lancashire Lass, for the rescue from drowning in the Murray on the 30th of January 1895, Miss Louisa Sebastian, 16 years of age, a resident of Echuca West. Charlie was naturalised as a British subject in Australia in 1897. On the 6th of June 1899, in the Shipping Intelligence at the port of Echuca, it mentions the Julia with Wallin as the master going from Pensacola with sawn timber and sleepers. On the 14th of January 1903, it announces the sinking of a river barge at Mildura. The barge belonging to the steamer Julia, an Echuca boat under Captain Wallin, is reported to have sunk this morning near Co-op, about 40 miles upstream from Mildura. The Julia was proceeding to the Darling with supplies. On the 21st of June 1905, there was an article titled "A Murray Steamboat Not Licensed to Carry Passengers, the Captain Fined." A case of much interest to owners of steamers trading on the Murray River was heard yesterday at the Echuca Police Court. F.O. Wallin, master of the steamer Julia, was charged with a breach of the Marine Act 1890 in carrying a greater number of passengers than that was allowed by the certificate issued in respect of that vessel. The date of the alleged offence was on the 11th of December 1904, in which date the vessel was hired by Mr. C. Gilmore, Secretary of the Druida Lodge, to convey a number of excursions to the Cumragunga Mission Station. Superintendent Waters prosecuted, and Mr. A.J. O'Dwyer appeared for the defendant, who pleaded not guilty. Superintendent Waters is opening the case, stating that during the passage of the steamer the Julia on the 11th of December, with a number of passengers, a serious accident was narrowly averted, a lady having been caught in a portion of the machinery and with great difficulty extricated. The owner of the vessel, Captain Wallin, had no certificate entitling him to carry passengers. The first witness called was Rebecca Lubert, who stated that she remembered on the 11th of December she was on board the steamer Julia, which ran an excursion to the Cumragunga Mission Station. There were a large number of excursionists. Superintendent Waters asked, "Did anything occur on the steamer that caused you to remember that date?" And the witness said, "Yes, I was nearly killed on it." "How long did the trip last?" She said, "All day. It was 9 o'clock at night when we got back, and I had to be carried from the steamer." Charlotte Sharman was asked, "Were you on board the Julia that day?" She said, "Yes." "Did you have a ticket?" "Yes," she replied. "Where did you go?" "Up the river to Barmer." "Were there many people aboard the vessel?" She said there were over 20 passengers. "Did you see Captain Wallin on that day?" She said, "Yes, he was in charge of the Julia." The superintendent asked, "Was Mr. Gilmore managing the boat on that day?" And she said, "No." Charles Gilmore, cab driver, remembered the 11th of December. He was on the steamer Julia that day, the master being Mr. Wallin. There were between 30 and 40 people on the boat. And he was asked, "Are you one of the 4 gentlemen who hired the steamer?" He said, "Yes, there were 4 of us, but I engaged the boat from Mr. Wallin for a day's outing on the Sunday. Mr. Wallin told me a fortnight previously that he was not licensed to carry passengers but would hire the boat." "Who managed the boat and under whose instructions?" He said, "Mr. Wallin." Constable McCarthy stated he was on duty at the wharf on the 9th of the 11th of December, and between 9 and 10 o'clock the steamer Julia arrived with a number of excursionists. Mr. Wallin was the master of the vessel. Mrs. Lubert was on board. until the other passengers had disembarked, and afterwards she was taken to Dr. Kelly's surgery and subsequently to hospital. Captain Wallin was fined £1, 7 shillings and 6 in costs. A week later, it stated that the steamer Australian by Captain Wallin arrived yesterday from Barmer with a load of sleepers. On the 19th of February 1906, the Riverine Herald published an article stating Murray steamer wrecked. Intelligence reached Echuca on Saturday afternoon that the steamer Julia, owned by Captain Wallin, had been wrecked 20 miles downstream. The vessel left here a few days ago to engage in operations in the Murray, and while proceeding to a destination, the catastrophe happened. From what he learned, it seemed that the steamer struck one of the numerous snags that abound in that part of the river, driving a huge hole in her keel. An attempt was made to beach the vessel, but she filled so rapidly that efforts in this direction were futile and the steamer sank in 15 feet of water. The crew, however, managed to save their lives by swimming ashore. Nothing was saved on board the boat, which carried a quantity of stores. The loss is a serious one for Mr. Wallin, as he had just a few days previously entered into a contract for snagging 38 chains of the Murray River. By October 1906, there was shipping intelligence at the port of Echuca stating that the Australian, Captain Wallin, arrived from the Edward River with 900 bales of wool. 2 weeks later, it announced that the steamer Australian, owned by Captain Wallin, arrived yesterday from the Edward containing 1,100 bales of wool, and the vessel will sail again this morning. In June 1907, it announced a river trip. At 11 o'clock, the convention adjourned. The delegates and other visitors made their way to the gangway, where the steamers Maggie, under the charge of Captain Cantwell, and the Australian, piloted by Captain Wallin, were ready to take the Society's guests up the river. The Lieutenant Governor was expected in from Moira and joined the boat at 11, and shortly after that hour, the motor car from Moira, provided for the occasion by Mr. L. Faulkner, whizzed across the bridge and down to the boat. The Federal Band was in attendance. On the 25th of April 1908, it mentions that Baldwin and Gray, a well-known local iron firm, this week signed a contract to construct a large ferry steamer for the River Murray trade to the order of Captain Wallin of Echuca. The vessel will be built in sections at the firm's Williamstown yard and transported to Echuca, where the various parts will be consolidated and the steamer completely ready for active service. This paddle steamer was named Oscar W. and built in 1908. He named the vessel after his son. At the time the Oscar W. was built, Charlie had already owned the steamers the Australian and the Julia, and also the barges Adam, Federal and Impulse, and he later went on to own a number of other vessels. On completion, the Oscar W. did her trials in the Goulburn River and was then put into service in the Murrumbidgee River and the Upper Murray trade. And on the 7th of July 1909, it stated that the steamer Oscar W. has been purchased from Captain Wallin by Permewen Wright and Company, and the steamer Clyde given in exchange. On the 18th of June 1910, it mentions that Franz Oscar Wallin, steamboat proprietor, said that about 50,000 bales of wool have passed over the wharf last season. The river traffic was increasing, new vessels being built, and a few days ago a barge was launched and another one was on the slip. He himself owned 2 steamers. On the 2nd of September 1911, there was an announcement in the paper of a new barge. On Saturday last, another addition to the fine fleet of vessels constructed in Echuca and trading on the Murray River, in the shape of a new barge, was launched at the slip opposite the wharf. The barge was designed and constructed by and under the supervision of Mr. F. O. Wallin, the owner. It is what is known of composite construction, the upper portion, frames and girders, being of iron, and the lower portion being sheathed in the usual way with red gum. The whole of the construction work was done in Echuca, the Echuca shipwrights and one of the foundries supplying the labour, except as to a portion of the ironwork which was carried out by experts from Melbourne. Its carrying capacity in bales of wool should be nearly 1,000, and it is so constructed that it could easily be fitted as a steamer. The Vega, by which name the boat has been called, was immediately sent down the river with the steamer Australian for the purpose of loading wool. The vessel took 16 weeks to construct, and a large amount of money was distributed in wages. Captain Wallin is to be congratulated on his enterprise. And then on the 14th of September 1911, the new barge, lately constructed by Captain Wallin, completed her maiden voyage yesterday evening. The steamer Australian brought up this barge laden with wool and another barge also loaded from Swan Hill in 62 hours, which was exceptionally good time. The barge has completely fulfilled all expectations. On the 21st of November 1912, it says in Echuca on Sunday, by the generosity of Captain Wallin, owner of the steamer Clyde, a party of sportsmen had an excursion to the Moira Lakes. The steamer left Echuca Wharf early yesterday and ran quickly to the fine sporting waters of the river where it passes through the lakes. There was a line and hook. Those keen on angling got good hauls. Among the party were Mr. Rowe from Western Australia and Mr. H. Greville from Melbourne. The visitors were delighted with the variety of river and lake scenery and with a pleasant outing. And on the 18th of July 1915, Franz Oscar Wallin, steamboat owner, the river trade, which has doubled within the last few years. In a good year, over 30 men were employed at the slip across the river. And on the 21st of August 1915, in the Moolameen items, the Moolameen Red Cross are industriously working day and night to make garments for our Australian sick and wounded soldiers, and last week dispatched a very large case of comforts to the Melbourne Red Cross depot. Captain Wallin of the steamer Clyde carried the case free to Echuca. On the 9th of January 1917, the article titled The Wheat Pool, Competition Between Shippers and Millers. In Echuca, the Victorian Chamber of Agriculture is urging farmers to do their part to see that the local mill gets all the requirements from the district by first offering their wheat to the representatives of the mill. The Chamber states that the wheat is handled by the miller at half the cost to the pool as compared with the shipping agent's charges. As far as Echuca is concerned, the trouble seems to be that the shipping agents are in active competition with the millers for wheat. Captain Wallin has secured the contract from New South Wales farmers, who are members of the Farmers and Settlers Association, for carriage of their wheat by steamer to Echuca, providing it is sent to Melbourne. Particular interest is being taken in the next shipment of wheat to be brought here, in view of the recent action by the Railway Department regarding the unloading of some 3,000 bags brought here by steamer for transfer to Melbourne. The department stated that the wheat commissioners had decided that all wheat brought to Echuca should be milled here. And on the 23rd of February 1918, Oscar Wallin, steamboat owner, said that he'd worked out the cost of a voyage in the wool season on the Clyde and found it did not pay. The revenue of the trip was £121, expenses £124. He did not allow in this balance for depreciation or other overhead charges. This was a fair average of the Clyde's work, but it did not apply to the Australian. There was very little trade on the river in the year following the drought, but has since increased. The wool rate from the Edward was 25 per tonne. If drivers' wages were increased, it could mean an increase to skippers and all round. If the claims were granted, he could not continue to run the Clyde. He would not say what he would do with the Australian. If he could not sell her, he would have to do something with her. On the 23rd of September 1918, under the title of River Trade, Captain F. O. Wallin's steamer, the Colonial, and the barge Federal arrived from Paracuta with 600 bales of wool and took up a berth down the river shortly after noon yesterday. Captain Wallin's Clyde and barge were expected last night with 600 bales of wool from the Edward River. So it seems like he kept the Clyde and it's doing a good trade by the September. On the 4th of June 1919, it said that Captain Wallin will be, at the very first opportunity, will remove the bad obstructions between the junction and Moolameen at a cost of no more than £8 per day, and that he will undertake to complete the work within a period of 14 days. By 1919, the falling river trade was taking effect, and the Murray Shipping Company was formed by the amalgamation of a number of companies, including Pimure Wright. Oscar W. was one of the vessels that went to the new company. On the 4th of September 1925, it was reported that the Invincible steamer, owned by Captain Wallin, with the barge Shamrock in tow, met with disaster 12 miles from Euston on Saturday morning when the barge hit a rocky bank and went down in a few minutes. She was loaded with 140 piles for the Mildura Bridge. Neither the barge nor the cargo was insured. And on the 21st of August, the steamer Australian and barge, owned by Captain Wallin of Echuca, passed through Hay on Wednesday to an upriver station to load wool. This steamer returned to Hay today and left for Echuca with 500 bales of wool. Charlie Wallin did not join the Murray Shipping Company. He continued to trade in his own right until his death on the 16th of August 1934 in Echuca. And the funeral of Captain F. O. Wallin was announced in the local paper on the 18th of August. The funeral of the late Captain F.O. Wallin took place yesterday, and the largest assemblage at the graveside bore impressive testimony to the high esteem in which he was held by all sections of the community. And his obituary reads, "The death of Captain F.O. Wallin, which occurred yesterday at his home in Watson Street, removes one who has been closely identified with the commercial and sporting activities of the town over a period of many years. The late Captain Wallin's health has been indifferent for some time, but being possessed of an indomitable spirit, he attended as far as possible to his usual avocations until a short time ago, where he was compelled to take to his bed. Born near Stockholm in Sweden, he was entered, when of age, into the Navy as an apprentice and served as a man of war, both sail and steam, for 4 years, when he transferred to the mercantile marine. During the succeeding years, he sailed the seas from China to Peru and from Sydney to Rio de Janeiro. Australia attracted him, and in 1887 he foretook the sea and came ashore to Port Melbourne and settled in Victoria. 2 years later, he came to Echuca and engaged in the river trade, which was then booming. He purchased his first river steamer, Julia. He then bought the Australian, and 4 years later built the Oscar and the barge Vega. The Oscar was a well-found ship, and he turned her over to the Pumune Riding Company a year after she was registered. In 1920, he purchased the Invincible from Mr. George Betcune of Echuca and rebuilt her. For over 40 years, Captain Wallin has been a well-known figure amongst the Murray, Darling and Murrumbidgee rivers. In his younger days, Mr. Wallin was an oarsman of note and was a member of the Echuca East Bowling Club. Latterly, he's been more interested in racing and football. As an owner, he met with considerable success at the picnic races and professional meetings. He was vice president of the Echuca Racing Club for some years. Mr. Wallin enjoyed a wide popularity and the affectionate regard of many friends. And on the 5th of November 1934, with his will and estate, it says that Franz Oscar Wallin, late of Echuca, steamboat proprietor, left personal property of £6,369 to his widow. On the 30th of November 1934, it announced that the steamer Australian was sold and purchased by King and Jones, and it left the Echuca wharf on Thursday for Yarrawonga, where it will be used in the timber trade. And in 1942, there was some recollections, and it stated that Captain Foster had been connected with river traffic since 1891, and for 25 years he was the master of the boats Australian and Invincible for Captain Wallin. And in 1949, it says Murray boats leave today. Few people are expected to say farewell to the Invincible and the barge Vega when they sail from Echuca at dawn today, bound for Renmark, South Australia. Echuca has, however, granted a good river for the voyage of 2 vessels famous in the 20s and 30s as the late Captain F.O. or Charlie Wallin's fleet. They will give a special salute for the benefit of Mrs. Wallin, the late Captain's widow, who lives in Watson Street. Charlie and Daisy Wallin had 3 children. The firstborn was Oscar William Murray Wallin, and he was born on the 5th of December 1897 at Yarrawonga. As Oscar grew, his parents determined that he wouldn't carry on the family business, but rather he would work in banking. While still at school, Oscar was a member of the cadets and looked forward to joining the militia when he was old enough. On the 5th of August 1913, it says, drill shirkers punished. Oscar Wallin was charged in the police court this morning by Captain McClellan for failing to attend the requisite number of drills. The defendant pleaded guilty and committed to the custody of the staff's sergeant major. After finishing his schooling at Echuca State School, he started working for the London Bank. After working in the Echuca branch, he transferred to the Hay branch in New South Wales, and in July 1915, a recruiting drive through country New South Wales occurred, including in Hay. As a result, Oscar, with his family's permission, enlisted in World War I on the 5th of August 1915 at Cootamundra, New South Wales. He left Sydney on the 30th of September 1915 aboard the Argyllshire. He was originally assigned to the 4th Reinforcement of the 18th Battalion and was taken on strength by this battalion on the 10th of January, but was then transferred to the 8th Battalion in Egypt on the 24th of February 1916. And a small article saying back in Egypt, writing from Tel el-Kabir on the 19th of January, Private Jones says, "We are back in Egypt again and a camp 65 miles from Heliopolis, getting fit for the next job. We are looking well. I also saw Oscar Wallin. He is well and has not been in action yet." On the 26th of March, Oscar left Egypt and arrived in Marseille on the 31st before travelling across France by train to the Western Front. Oscar had a history of suffering from the cold, and on the 22nd of April he was sent to hospital with bronchopneumonia. His recovery was drawn out, and he didn't rejoin his battalion until the 23rd of December 1916. He fell ill again in early January, and over the next 5 months spent much time in hospital. It wasn't until the 25th of May 1917 that he joined the battalion again. For the next few months, the battalion spent time resting and training until early September, when it made its way forward to the front line, and on the 20th of September, the 8th Battalion was the third line of attack in the Battle of Menin Road, moving through Glencorse Wood to their final objective just south of Polygon Wood. During this fighting, Oscar was hit by a shell and killed. He was originally buried near Clapham Junction, but his body was exhumed after the war and reinterred in Tynecott Cemetery in Belgium. On the 23rd of October 1917, there was a roll of honour outlining the Echuca soldiers killed, one Private O.W. Wallin. The name of another hero has been added to the long list of Echuca soldiers who have made their sacrifice of life and limb for Australia and the Empire. Yesterday, Reverend Watsford and Reverend Buntine had the painful duty to perform the breaking of the sad news to Mr. and Mrs. F. O. Wallin of Watson Street that their son, Private Oscar W. Wallin, had been killed in action at the front on the 20th of September. The bereavement is more sad because Private Wallin was an only son, and when he went to the war, a little over 2 years ago, he was an only child. Subsequently, there's been born a baby sister who has never seen the gallant soldier brother, who is now numbered amongst the slain. Private Wallin was only 17 when he enlisted in Hay a little over 2 years ago, and was not quite 20 when he met the soldier's fate, his birthday being in December. He was only in camp a month before sailing to Egypt, and he went to France with the first contingent of Australians and had been there without a holiday for nearly 2 years. Last week, a letter was received from him by his parents, dated the 19th of August, saying that he was expected to go on furlough to England, but that leave was apparently not granted. Private Wallin was a bright boy, of a genial and happy disposition, and the news of his death came as a shock to his many friends in the town. With Mr. and Mrs. Wallin, the deepest sympathies expressed in their tragic loss. As a mark of esteem and respect for the gallant soldier, the flag at the town hall yesterday was lowered to half-mast. And his death notice stated, Wallin, officially reported as killed in action in France. After 2 years of faithful service, Private Oscar Wallin, 8th Battalion, dearly loved only son of Mr. and Mrs. F. O. Wallin, Echuca, and loving brother of little Vera. Aged 19 years and 10 months, a young life nobly ended. And on the 16th of December 1918, fallen high school students. Mr. R.C. Hogan's last public official act as headmaster of the Echuca High School was appropriately enough to unveil a handsome framed enlargement of the portrait of the late Private Oscar Wallin, who was killed in action in France, acting as a runner for his commanding officer. The portrait was presented by Mrs. F. O. Wallin. The school having met together in the art room, Mr. Hagan paid a tribute of affectionate regard to Oscar Wallin, who he said was one of the foundation students of the school. He was a good lad who had been much beloved by his parents, teachers and fellow students, a boy of generous and happy temperament who had fallen for the liberty of his native land. Mr. Welsh, being asked to say a few words, said that he had an affection for Oscar Wallin, whom he taught for several years and would not forget. The deceased was a bright, generous-hearted boy. Mr. Welsh knew his faults and had perhaps loved him for them, for they were all the faults of an open, frank and good lad. They did have another son that was born in 1901 in Echuca but died in 1901. And then Alice Vera, their daughter, was born in 1915 in Echuca, but she died in 1918 in Fitzroy. It states, Wallin, on the 31st of December at the private hospital, Melbourne, Vera, the dearly loved daughter of F.O. and Daisy Wallin, sister of the late Private Oscar Wallin, 2 years and 2 months. So unfortunately it left no descendants of Charlie Wallin and his wife Daisy. So what happened to the boat, the Oscar W? Well, by 1942, Murray Shipping had turned to the tourist passenger trade to survive, and the old workboats were sold off. Oscar W was sold to George Ritchie of Goolwa. Ritchie came from a shipping background, and the Ritchies being among the crews that brought the earliest steamers out to South Australia in 1855. Ritchie planned to turn Oscar W into a tourist vessel, but wartime shortages of materials and manpower meant that this was not possible. So in 1943 he sold the vessel to another Goolwa syndicate, who very quickly found the same problem. They sold the Oscar W later in 1943 to the South Australian Government Highways Department, where it was used to service the ferries along the river. The department converted her to oil burning in 1945 because of a lack of cut wood along the river. By 1959, a new vessel was needed to carry out this work, and Oscar W was replaced, and in 1960 was sold to Paddy Hogg for £50. Paddy took the vessel to Mildura, where he used her as a tourist vessel and also in general work that could be found. Probably the best known task for the Oscar W was towing the old steamer the Gem from Mildura to Swan Hill in 1963. The Gem was to be used as part of the historical village being built there and was expected that the voyage would take about 2 weeks. The trip was straightforward, although the river beyond the Walcool Junction is quite narrow and can be treacherous. There is a notorious reef a few miles from the junction. The voyage went well until this point was reached and low water stopped them there. It was almost 8 months before the water came down to allow the vessels to cross the reef and continue to Swan Hill. In 1964, Paddy Hogg sold the Oscar W to Alan Moritz, and she then headed back to the bottom end of the river. Alan started the long process of restoring the vessel, and she was slipped for major hull repairs. Unfortunately, Alan Moritz died before his work was completed, and no funding was available to assist. So Oscar W was sold in 1985 to the South Australian Tourist Commission, who were involved in the establishment of an interpretive exhibition at Goolwa. Funding was made available and the Oscar W was put back into river-worthy condition and steamed to Goolwa, arriving on the 31st of March 1988. The Oscar W is maintained at Goolwa as a working exhibit and is used to demonstrate how the vessels were worked on the rivers. Since returning to Goolwa, the Oscar W has taken part in many events along the river, the most notable one being the return to Echuca in 1991 on a 7-week voyage. During this trip, the vessel also ventured into the Murrumbidgee River for 25 miles, the first vessel to do so since at least the 1956 flood or possibly earlier. She also ventured up the Darling River for 38 miles, and while at Echuca went up the Goulburn River to Stewart's Bridge, now the limit of navigation on the Goulburn, and 1,083 river miles from Goolwa. Another trip was a record-breaking run to Wentworth in 4 days and 23 hours towing a barge. This trip was a 24-hour-a-day run, done in 4-hour shifts. In 1994, she took part in the centenary celebrations for Waikerie, and on return, the Oscar W was taken out of commission because of the condition of the boiler. The possibility of rebuilding the boiler was investigated, but in the end, it was decided to have a new boiler built. This meant a huge amount of work and fundraising with the help of funding from the Tourist Commission, the Council, and the funds were raised to be able to contract Forbes Engineering to build a new boiler in 1996. The boiler was installed in February 1997 with just 2 weeks to go before the Wooden Boat Festival, and all of the plumbing work still had to be done. This was achieved and the Oscar W was in steam for the festival weekend. The centenary of the Oscar W occurred in 2008 and there were extensive celebrations along the river. A restaurant on the Echuca Wharf was named Oscar W's after the boat. It closed in 2014. The restaurant had earned 1 hat in the Age Good Food Guide twice since it opened in 2005 and 2012.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.